Hey everyone, it is late at night and I'm Norman. Well, I did a bad thing. I purchased a 3,000 subscribers celebratory watch, and it was actually a piece that one of you suggested. In fact, all of your suggestions on the video that I did for the 3,000 subscribers, which at that time was up and coming, were absolutely brilliant. They were so great. I'm going to take all of your suggestions from that video, take some notes, grab some photos, and do an entire video on the pieces that you suggested that I consider for purchase. Because, yeah, they were all just so great. It actually made my choice a tough one, because some of you suggested saving up and waiting, and that's definitely a viable option. But the watches that you brought to my attention were all so cool that it felt weird picking one amongst them. But I did. Because when I looked this particular watch up, I was immediately obsessed with it. And I couldn't stop looking at pictures of it. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos about it. And it's a piece that was completely new to me. So I'm a little bit late to the game on this one. There's a bunch of videos out there already discussing this watch, but I hadn't encountered any of those. I'd seen one of their other models, thanks to one of my all-time favorite YouTubers, Caseback Tim. He did a video on it, but I never really dug into the brand. Otherwise, I would have found this one. What watch did I end up purchasing? The Nevada F77. I'll explain a little bit more on why I was so obsessed with this watch when I saw it. And I'll do my first impressions of it now that I get to see it in person, and I'll put it on the wrist and let you see what it looks like. So let us begin. Here is the Nevada Grenchen F77. And I think the reason why I was so obsessed with this watch when I saw it is it's kind of a mashup of other sports watches that I really like. So I'm definitely a dress watch person, a vintage dress watch person. In fact, every day, for the most part, I'm wearing a dress watch. However, ever since I borrowed a Rolex Explorer from a friend of mine, I have a soft spot for some sports watches as well, including the Explorer 1016, which is why I own the Everest, because that is a brilliant homage to that watch. And when I saw this piece, the dial reminded me of the Oyster Perpetual that I allegedly am on the list for. I really liked the textured dial on this. The case is kind of that retro 80s-ish style, kind of like the PRX or other watches like that. The crystal on it looks so vintage style. It's just amazing. And it wears so thin. I'm not necessarily a big Royal Oak fan, but in person, these screws on the bezel are pretty subtle. And I figured they probably wouldn't bother me much, and they don't. But yeah, this is a gorgeous piece. Like I mentioned, I had heard of this brand because Caseback Tim did a video on the Spider, which is such a one-of-a-kind design. So cool. I didn't dig any deeper, so I was completely unaware of this watch. Now, what is terrible about watches that come on bracelets is right out of the gate, the very first thing you have to do is remove links. So right when you open the watch, within the first minutes of owning it, you have to do something that could risk scratching the bracelet on accident if your screwdriver slips. Or like I did with this watch and inadvertently use a screwdriver that's too small. So I ended up munching one of the screw heads just a little bit. To the naked eye, it looks okay still. Under a loop, you can see it. There's still a decent groove on that screw though, but not cool. Look at the sheer amount of micro adjustment on this. That is cool. I wish the Everest had this many micro adjustments. That watch is really tough to get dialed in just right. This thing feels somewhat substantial. Now this watch just showed up today, but this bracelet so far seems pretty amazing. And my understanding is that this is sort of an homage to an homage, I suppose, since it's an homage to the Royal Oak, kind of, and it's an homage to this brand's old vintage variant of this. So I don't know if that's really an homage, more of a reissue, but apparently this design is very similar to their vintage version of it. And when I got it out of the box, it looked like a 36mm watch. It's just 1mm larger. However, the YouTubers who have reviewed this weren't lying in any of the things that they've said about this watch. The wingspan on it is definitely substantial. Even though it's a smaller watch, this will completely fill up the real estate of your wrist. But it doesn't look bad to me because look at how thin that appears. And when you're wearing it, it's just so flat on the wrist. It looks amazing. But it is interesting just how tall this watch is from lug to lug. And the YouTubers who've discussed this pointed out these end links here. And they're right, that is part of the reason, because these only angle a little bit. So really, the lug to lug is more like to the ends of these links. But wow, this watch is so cool looking. It arrived this afternoon and I've been wearing it ever since, and yeah, it looks absolutely brilliant. What do you guys think about these screws here? Do those bother you? Or are you a Royal Oak fan? For some reason, I've never really been overly intrigued by those watches. I actually like the Nautilus more, but I do like how subtle those screws are on this piece. They're extremely small and just look like indices on the bezel. One thing that was kind of a surprise to me is just how sparkly this watch is. When you see photographs of it in studio lighting, it doesn't appear that it really refracts light quite like it does. The crystal does a bunch of that amongst all of its distorting, and those indices are just chrome and glossy and shiny. So it's very dressy for a sporty piece. And the case back is pretty cool. Very deeply etched in there. It reminds me of a Christopher Ward case back. Yeah. So after I've spent some time with this, I'll get a full review of it for you. Get some more footage of it. But before I let you go, let's see what this looks like when you're wearing it. Tonight I am wearing the Motokata watch. And you can see that those lugs are starting to settle down a little bit from the first video I did on this watch. I put the Dan Henry strap on it, so it's a little bit thinner, more flexible. And after you've had this on the wrist for a while, the lugs just kind of settle in. See how that one's angled back? So it looks much more natural. Very cool design. I love it. Let me take this off and we'll see what the F77 looks like when you're wearing it. Here is the Nevada F77 on my 7-inch wrist. And it looks amazing. It absolutely hugs the wrist. And the overall vibe of it is just ultra thin, which is crazy. You can see how wide the lug-to-lug is a bit there. And you may also notice how large it wears. Even though it's 37 millimeters, I feel like if you're a 40 millimeter watch person, this might not be too terrible for you. It has a decent amount of wrist presence, and to me it doesn't feel small at all. I'll do a future video comparing this to the Everest and maybe one or two other sports watches that I own. When I first opened it up, I did hold the Everest up next to it, and the Everest looks absolutely tiny, even though it's only 1 millimeter smaller. It's so crazy what design does for apparent watch size. Yes. Absolutely amazing looking. So there you have it, the gorgeous F77. I personally love it. Yes, these are kind of spendy, but it's a contemporary piece, which is great for my tradition of purchasing a celebratory watch for each time our community here grows by 1,000 more subscribers. Since I generally hunt for vintage watches, vintage dressy watches, it's kind of cool to switch gears and see what new pieces there are out there. Thanks for watching.